What if the person sitting across from you at dinner was the last person alive to see a life snuffed out, and you unknowingly ate the evidence? In a small, dusty town in Arizona, 1876, a secret simmered behind closed doors, one so vile, it was never meant to see the light of day. Whispers of vanished men, strange family meals, and a wife whose calm demeanor hid something monstrous. Why did no one speak? Why were the warnings ignored? Tonight, we uncover a truth so unsettling. It forces us to question the thin line between survival, madness, and murder. The year was 1876, and Arizona was still very much a frontier. Vast stretches of desert and scrubland extended in every direction, dotted with small settlements that seemed more like fragile outposts than proper towns. The sun rose with a harsh intensity, baking the earth and casting long shadows across the dusty streets. Life here was hard, unforgiving, and often brutal, shaping the character of those who dared to settle in this remote and lawless land. In such a place, survival was never guaranteed. Water was scarce, food was hard-won, and neighbors were often miles apart. Communities were small, tight-knit, and suspicious of outsiders, yet they depended heavily on one another for help and protection. It was a land where men and women had to be resilient, self-reliant, and wary, for danger could appear in the form of wild animals, bandits, or the harsh elements themselves. Into this unforgiving landscape came Elizabeth and Thomas. Their house was modest, typical of the period, a simple structure of timber and adobe with a small yard and the faint outline of a vegetable garden. From the outside, everything appeared ordinary. A wife tending to chores, a husband performing the necessary labor to sustain their lives. But behind the closed doors of their home, tension festered. Marital life in the frontier was rarely easy. Men often worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and women carried the immense burden of household management, child-rearing, and often agricultural labor. The isolation of the Arizona desert could magnify personal conflicts, and secrets had a way of festering when there was nowhere to hide from them. Elizabeth herself was a woman of contrasts. Outwardly, she presented as dutiful and calm, the kind of neighbor who would greet others politely while maintaining an air of careful reserve. But there was something calculating beneath her surface, a sharp intelligence and an awareness of the delicate balance between appearance and reality. She knew the value of perception, of crafting an image that would discourage suspicion. Thomas, her husband, was a man of ambition and temperament, occasionally prone to fits of anger, yet generally bound by the social codes of the time, which demanded a stoic endurance of life's hardships. Their relationship was complicated, a mixture of necessity, routine, and unspoken resentments that slowly accumulated like layers of dust in their home. The community around them was small and observant, accustomed to noticing changes in behavior, because isolation amplified even the smallest disturbances. In frontier towns, everyone knew when a neighbor was missing a meal, an hour of work, or a simple chore. Rumors spread quickly, yet the desert had a way of shielding secrets. A person could disappear, a rumor could be ignored, and the harshness of life often made survival the primary concern over morality. It was within this environment that Elizabeth's actions would eventually unfold, and the landscape itself, desolate, unforgiving, and sparsely populated, played a crucial role in both the crime and its concealment. Arizona in 1876 was not yet a state. It was a territory, and governance was minimal. Law enforcement was patchy, and the nearest officials could be hours or even days away by horseback. This absence of oversight created a sense of autonomy for those willing to bend the rules, and, in some cases, it offered the cover needed to commit acts that might be unthinkable elsewhere. Crimes that might have been discovered immediately in more populated areas could remain hidden here for months, even years, buried under layers of dust, secrecy, and the relentless pace of frontier life. The social fabric was such that people were suspicious, yet focused on their own survival. A neighbor might notice a change but be unwilling or unable to intervene, either out of fear or because they had their own challenges to confront. The climate, too, played its part. Summers were blistering, turning the earth into cracked, dry plates that shimmered under the relentless sun. Winters brought cold nights and occasional frost, requiring constant vigilance and preparation to maintain even the simplest comforts. Food preservation was primitive. Meat had to be salted or smoked, and vegetables stored carefully to avoid spoilage. In this context, a sudden absence of a husband or a missing component from the household could be attributed to chance, illness, or misfortune. The harsh environment shaped human behavior, creating a culture where necessity could justify otherwise unthinkable actions. Survival often came at the expense of morality, and desperation could warp perception and decision-making in ways that blurred the line between right and wrong. Elizabeth's home, though small, was meticulously kept. The kitchen was her domain, a place of routine and control where the minutiae of daily life could be managed with precision. It was in such spaces that the extraordinary could go unnoticed, hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of domesticity. The sight of a meal prepared, a table set, and children fed created an illusion of normalcy that few questioned. In frontier Arizona, appearances were powerful. The act of looking ordinary, of maintaining composure and domestic ritual, could shield a person from scrutiny even when darkness lay beneath. Social expectations also influenced behavior. Women were expected to be nurturing, patient, and capable of handling domestic duties with grace. Deviations from these roles could arouse suspicion or social censure, so those who wished to act outside societal norms often concealed their intentions carefully. Elizabeth, by adhering to outwardly conventional roles, ensured that her actions would remain obscured, at least for a time. The structure of the household and the surrounding community, combined with the isolation of the territory, allowed her to navigate the treacherous line between social expectation and private transgression. Life in the Arizona frontier was defined by extremes of weather, danger, and morality. In such a world, the ordinary could hide the extraordinary, and the unthinkable could be masked by routine. The year 1876, a period of expansion, settlement, and survival, created the perfect backdrop for a crime that would shock those who learned of it. The environment shaped the characters, dictated their daily lives, and set the stage for a dark secret that would remain hidden behind the facade of a quiet, well-kept home. Even as Elizabeth went about her chores, tending to the small garden, sweeping the floor and preparing meals, the shadow of what she had done lingered invisibly. The unforgiving landscape, the sparse population, and the limited oversight of the law all combined to make it possible for an ordinary home to conceal an extraordinary crime. The isolation of Arizona, coupled with the harsh conditions and social expectations, created both the opportunity and the means to commit acts that might otherwise be impossible elsewhere. It was a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where survival could overshadow conscience, and where a dark secret could remain hidden under the guise of everyday life. In the end, understanding the setting of Arizona in 1876 is essential to comprehending the full scope of what transpired within Elizabeth's home. It was a place that shaped behavior, enabled secrecy, and magnified the consequences of human choice. Every action, every decision, every glance and gesture was influenced by the land itself. Harsh, isolating, and indifferent, the frontier was a crucible of character, a mirror reflecting both the best and worst of human nature, and it was within this crucible that a story of murder, deception, and unspeakable acts would quietly unfold, leaving a mark on history that would linger, far longer than the dusty streets of the town ever would. Elizabeth and Thomas's marriage was not the sort of union born from romance or shared dreams. It was a partnership of necessity, forged in a world that demanded resilience and practicality above affection. In 1876, Arizona, companionship was as much about survival as it was about emotional connection. The frontier was unforgiving, and two people living together in isolation had to rely on one another not only for daily tasks, but also for the fragile security of their home. Elizabeth was keenly aware of this reality. She understood that her presence, her domestic skill, and her ability to manage the household were as crucial as Thomas's labor in the fields, repairs, and hunting. Yet, beneath this veneer of practicality lay a complex and volatile web of emotions, resentments, and unspoken grievances. Thomas was a man of considerable ambition, though it often clashed with the limitations imposed by frontier life. He had expectations of Elizabeth that she found increasingly difficult to meet, not out of unwillingness, but because the weight of daily survival was heavy, relentless, and unrelenting. He expected obedience, domestic competence, and a quiet acquiescence to his authority, and though Elizabeth performed these duties with precision, she resented the strict confines of her role. Each command, each minor correction, each admonishment added to a growing sense of frustration that simmered beneath her composed exterior. In a world where survival was paramount, emotional expression was often stifled, and grievances accumulated in secret, invisible to those around them. Their home was a stage for this quiet tension. Meals were prepared with meticulous care, the floors were kept swept, and the children's needs were attended to with routine efficiency. Yet the air in the house was often heavy with unspoken words. Thomas's moods could shift unpredictably, his frustration sometimes spilling into anger. Elizabeth learned to read the signs, a clenched jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a sharpness in the tone of voice. She developed a precise rhythm, anticipating his needs and moods, moving through the day like a dancer in a dangerous choreography where misstep could provoke ire. It was not merely obedience. It was a survival strategy, one that required constant attention and calculation. Despite their conflicts, there were moments when the marriage appeared, to outsiders, to function normally. Neighbors might have seen a husband and wife working side by side, attending church, or engaging in polite conversation at the market, yet these appearances masked the complex, often disturbing reality of their relationship. Elizabeth's resentment was not merely emotional, it was strategic. She understood that in this isolated environment, power was measured by perception. Her careful management of appearances allowed her to maintain control over her private world, even as Thomas exerted control over the more visible aspects of their life. This duality, the public compliance and private defiance, created a tension that, like a coiled spring, would eventually find a devastating release. In many ways, the frontier magnified the psychological stakes of their marriage. Isolation meant that there were no neutral observers, no mediators, and no easy escape. Small slights became monumental, and the monotony of daily life provided ample space for grudges to grow unchecked. Elizabeth's mind, sharp and calculating, began to weigh possibilities and consequences with meticulous care. She understood Thomas's patterns, his vulnerabilities, and the points at which he could be manipulated or coerced. This was not merely a marriage of survival. It became a chess game. Each move calculated, each reaction anticipated, each step measured against potential outcomes. The children, innocent and unaware, added another layer of complexity. Elizabeth's role as a mother demanded nurturing, attentiveness, and care, yet it also provided her with a sense of purpose and leverage within the family structure. Thomas's presence as a father was more sporadic, shaped by labor, hunting, and the practicalities of survival. In this dynamic, Elizabeth began to recognize that her influence over the household was absolute in the domestic sphere. The tension with Thomas, then, was not only about personal grievances, but about control, authority, and the assertion of power in a world where power was otherwise scarce. Resentment, however, is a subtle and corrosive force. It grows slowly, often unnoticed, until it becomes nearly unmanageable. Elizabeth had long endured the constraints of her life, performing her duties with exacting precision while quietly observing the limitations imposed upon her. She saw the patterns of Thomas's behavior, the moments of irritation, the lapses in judgment, and the weaknesses he displayed. Over time, these observations crystallized into a dark understanding that she could, if she chose, exert influence in ways that went beyond the ordinary boundaries of marriage. This realization was not sudden. It emerged gradually, a product of prolonged exposure to isolation, frustration, and the harshness of frontier life. There were incidents, small but telling, that hinted at the potential for tragedy. Arguments over household management, disputes about money, disagreements about discipline. Each seemed mundane in isolation, but collectively painted a portrait of an increasingly volatile relationship. Elizabeth, ever observant, began to calculate the consequences of each action, each confrontation. She understood that in this environment, a decisive, irreversible act could reshape the power dynamics of the household entirely. In the harsh world of 1876 Arizona, where law enforcement was distant and oversight minimal, the theoretical became feasible. The boundaries between right and wrong, survival and morality, began to blur. Thomas's temper, combined with his physical presence and social authority, had long intimidated Elizabeth, yet she also recognized the fragility beneath his exterior. In a world where perception mattered as much as action, she could use subtlety, timing, and strategy to manipulate outcomes in her favor. She observed him, studied his habits, and contemplated the possibilities. Each scenario weighed carefully, each potential act of defiance or assertion measured against risk and reward. This was not impulsive violence. It was deliberation honed over years of observation and survival instincts sharpened by the isolation of the frontier. By the summer of 1876, the tension had reached a critical mass. The marriage, which had begun as a pragmatic alliance, had transformed into a battleground of psychology, strategy, and latent hostility. Elizabeth's understanding of her husband's patterns, her own capacity for calculated action, and the absence of immediate oversight combined to create a situation in which ordinary grievances could give rise to extraordinary consequences. In a world where isolation amplified every human emotion, where survival demanded constant calculation, and where the lines between morality and necessity were perpetually blurred, the stage was set for an event that would shock even the most hardened observers. Through all of this, the children remained oblivious to the underlying currents of conflict and calculation. Elizabeth maintained a careful balance, nurturing mother, dutiful wife, and shrewd observer of her surroundings. The household operated with the appearance of normalcy, even as the undercurrent of tension, resentment, and latent danger grew stronger with each passing day. Each glance, each gesture, each carefully crafted word became part of an unspoken negotiation, a delicate interplay between compliance and assertion, between duty and desire, between survival and the contemplation of actions that would forever alter the lives of those within the household. The marriage of Elizabeth and Thomas, then, was more than the sum of its parts. It was a crucible in which human emotions, desires, and frustrations were concentrated and intensified by isolation, necessity, and the harshness of frontier life. Every day became an exercise in strategy, every interaction a test of control and influence. The tension, subtle yet pervasive, created the conditions under which the extraordinary, the unthinkable, could emerge. The story of their union, therefore, is not merely one of personal conflict but of a broader human truth, that under extreme circumstances, the pressures of environment, isolation, and human psychology can conspire to produce acts that challenge our understanding of morality, survival, and the boundaries of human behavior. The day Thomas died began like any other in the small Arizona settlement, with the desert sun creeping over the horizon, bathing the land in a harsh golden light that made the dust shimmer like tiny fragments of glass. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and baked earth, a reminder of the relentless environment in which the family lived. Inside their modest home, Elizabeth moved with a practiced calm, her hands busy with the familiar tasks that had come to define her mornings. There was an unspoken rhythm to her day, a precise choreography that masked the tension simmering beneath the surface. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding, his expression sharp and expectant. He was not yet aware that the events of this day would mark the irrevocable end of his life. Yet the subtle signs of their marital tension had been building for years, invisible to anyone but Elizabeth, who had studied him, memorized his habits, and anticipated his moods. She had observed the points at which his patience frayed, the moments when his anger could be provoked, and the weaknesses that could be exploited. The knowledge she carried was as dangerous as any weapon, and on this day it would become lethal. The confrontation began innocuously with a dispute over a minor domestic matter, a spilled bucket of water, a disagreement about the condition, of the tools outside, something so trivial that it might have been laughed off in another household. But the air between them was charged, every word heavy with layers of resentment and unspoken grievances. Elizabeth spoke with measured calm, her voice steady, masking the storm of calculation within her mind. Thomas, as was often the case, responded, with a temper that was both sharp and erratic, his words cutting through the quiet like a whip. The exchange escalated quickly, though to any outside observer, it might have seemed like an ordinary quarrel. Elizabeth's preparation for this moment had been subtle, deliberate, and meticulous. She had ensured that she would have the means to act without hesitation, tools at hand, and an awareness of the timing necessary to achieve her grim objective. This was not an impulsive act of rage, it was a calculated execution, the culmination of months, perhaps years, of observation, frustration, and strategic thinking. She understood that in the isolated environment of Arizona, with few neighbors and minimal oversight, her actions could be carried out with a degree of impunity. The moment of action was swift. Thomas, caught in the heat of argument and unaware of the precise danger, faltered. Elizabeth moved with decisiveness, striking with a focus born of both fear and resolve. There was no hesitation, no visible struggle prolonged over time. The act was over almost before it had begun, leaving behind only the silence that often follows sudden violence. The sound of the impact, the fleeting rustle of movement, and then the stillness. These became the markers of a life ended. Elizabeth's expression remained calm, a mask perfected over years of careful control, as she assessed the result and ensured that the finality of the act was complete. The aftermath required immediate consideration. The body could not remain in plain sight. It would attract questions, curiosity, and perhaps suspicion from neighbors or passers-by. In the sparse town, even the smallest disappearance was noticed, discussed, and remembered. Elizabeth's mind raced, balancing practical necessity with the psychological weight of what she had done. She recognized that the continuation of routine was essential. The household had to appear unbroken, the rhythms of daily life uninterrupted, so that no one might suspect the horror that had transpired within these walls. Elizabeth's decision to prepare the body for consumption was a calculated, horrifying extension of her crime. In frontier Arizona, where preservation of food was paramount and resources scarce, she knew that incorporating the remains into a family meal could serve multiple purposes: eliminating evidence, providing sustenance, and maintaining the appearance of normalcy. It was an act that required both psychological fortitude and meticulous planning. She selected the ingredients with care, seasoned the meat to mask any suspicion, and prepared the meal as she had countless times before, her hands steady, her mind focused, her demeanor unshaken. As the family gathered around the table, the scene was a chilling portrait of domestic normalcy. Plates were passed, children served, and conversation maintained, all under the shadow of the unspeakable act that had just occurred. Elizabeth's face, calm and composed, conveyed nothing of the atrocity behind the meal, while her thoughts remained occupied with timing, perception, and control. She observed the family, noting each movement, each expression, ensuring that nothing betrayed the hidden reality of the evening. The psychological tension of this act was immense. Elizabeth was fully aware of the enormity of what she had done, yet she had compartmentalized her fear, guilt, and anticipation into a rigid control over her environment. The small town, isolated and bound by survival, offered a unique stage for such an act. Here, normal life could continue uninterrupted, appearances maintained, and the unthinkable masked beneath routine. Her understanding of human behavior, coupled with the isolation of her environment, allowed her to navigate the aftermath with calculated precision. As the night deepened, Elizabeth's mind turned to the future. How long could this secret remain buried? What signs might emerge? What questions might arise? The tension between concealment and discovery became a constant undercurrent, shaping every action and decision. She knew that even minor mistakes could unravel the careful facade, and so every gesture, every word, every meal prepared and served had to be meticulously managed. The act of murder, completed with shocking swiftness, was only the first step in a broader strategy of control, deception, and survival. The surrounding community remained largely unaware. though human instinct and observation are rarely so easily fooled. Subtle changes, the absence of Thomas in daily routines, minor inconsistencies in conversation, or the unnatural calm of Elizabeth could have provoked curiosity, suspicion, or investigation. Yet in this frontier town, the harshness of daily life often overshadowed concern for moral or legal transgressions. Survival took precedence, and the isolation of the settlement provided both cover and complicity in the sense that neighbors had their own struggles to manage. Elizabeth's actions on that fateful day were a convergence of environment, psychology, and circumstance. The isolation of Arizona in 1876, the sparse oversight of the law, the tension of domestic life, and the intricacies of human behavior all combined to create the conditions under which murder and concealment could occur. It was not a story of sudden impulse, but of deliberate calculation, a chilling testament to how ordinary circumstances can give rise to extraordinary acts of darkness. The careful orchestration of the crime, the meticulous preparation for its concealment, and the maintenance of outward appearances all reflect a mind operating under extreme pressure, yet capable of extraordinary deception. By the end of the day, the household appeared unchanged to the outside world. The rhythms of life continued, meals were eaten, children went to bed, and the desert night settled over the town with its usual stillness. The unthinkable had occurred within these walls, yet the house betrayed no hint of the horror within. Elizabeth's calculated actions had ensured that the murder, though absolute in its reality, remained hidden beneath a veneer of ordinary domesticity, a secret held tightly in the quiet, oppressive silence of the Arizona frontier. The act Elizabeth undertook that evening was not one born of mere impulse, but of deliberate, horrifying calculation. In the vast, arid isolation of Arizona in 1876, she recognized the dual necessity of concealment and survival. The desert offered little mercy, and resources were scarce. Food had to be preserved carefully, and meals were often humble affairs, stretched to nourish as many as possible. Yet Elizabeth's mind, sharpened by years of observation and careful strategy, saw an opportunity in the grotesque that would forever mark her actions as something both pragmatic and unthinkable. She resolved to use the very essence of her crime to sustain the life of the household, while simultaneously ensuring that the evidence would vanish without a trace. The kitchen became a theater of grim precision. Elizabeth moved methodically, selecting ingredients with an air of domestic normalcy, while maintaining full awareness of what each step entailed. Her movements were deliberate, practiced, and devoid of hesitation. The tools she used were ordinary: knives, a sturdy pot, seasonings, firewood, yet they were instruments of a plan that required both physical dexterity and psychological fortitude. She prepared the meat carefully, ensuring that the taste, texture, and appearance would seem familiar and unremarkable to her family. Every detail was attended to with an obsessive attention born of fear, necessity, and the desire to control perception. As the meal simmered over the fire, Elizabeth's thoughts were a careful balance of calculation and inner conflict. There was no room for error. A misstep in seasoning, cooking, or presentation could arouse suspicion. Yet she had trained herself to compartmentalize, separating the moral horror of her actions from the practical task at hand. To her children, the aroma rising from the kitchen was no different from countless other evenings. The savory smell of stew mingling with the smoke of the hearth, the faint tang of herbs and vegetables. To the outside world, this was merely the familiar scent of a mother preparing dinner for her family. The macabre truth, however, was hidden in plain sight, masked by ordinary domesticity. Elizabeth's knowledge of her family's habits allowed her to manipulate the situation with terrifying precision. She understood which dishes they favored, the subtleties of taste that would seem familiar, and the timing that would minimize scrutiny. She placed the stew on the table with deliberate care, ensuring that each serving appeared identical to meals she had prepared countless times before. The children ate eagerly, unaware of the unthinkable nature of the food before them. Thomas's absence was noted but unremarkable, explained as business or errands. Every observation Elizabeth had made over the years, the family's routines, preferences, and expectations, was now a tool in her plan, used to enforce secrecy and control. Psychologically, the act was an exercise in dominance and concealment. Elizabeth had seized the ultimate control over life and death, transforming her knowledge of domestic routines into a weapon of deception. The act of feeding the remains of her husband to her family was more than concealment. It was an assertion of absolute agency, a demonstration of power over the very reality of the household. It required a mind capable of extraordinary focus and compartmentalization, for even a flicker of doubt or hesitation could compromise the delicate balance she maintained. She had to maintain composure, monitor reactions, and anticipate any sign of suspicion, all while performing one of the most psychologically demanding acts imaginable. The tension in the room was palpable, though it was invisible to those who were unaware of the truth. The children laughed and talked as they always did, passing bowls back and forth, engaging in small conversations about their day. Elizabeth participated in these exchanges with a practiced warmth, her voice steady, her gestures natural. The normalcy of these interactions was itself a tool of deception, a carefully maintained facade that disguised the horror she had woven into the fabric of the household. Every smile, every nod, every question answered with ease was a layer of protection, a means of controlling perception while hiding the unimaginable reality. Elizabeth's meticulous planning extended beyond the immediate act of cooking and serving the meal. She considered the aftermath. What questions might arise, what signs might betray her, and how she would respond to potential scrutiny. She had already accounted for common observations. Empty spots in the garden explained as work, trips, missing tasks attributed to fatigue, and the absence of Thomas justified by errands or obligations. Her strategy relied on the fact that in the isolated environment of 1876 Arizona, neighbors were more likely to overlook minor irregularities than to investigate potential wrongdoing. The frontier demanded focus on survival, and curiosity about another's domestic affairs was often subordinate to one's own needs. The act of cannibalism, therefore, was not simply a means of disposal. It was a calculated extension of the survival strategies embedded in frontier life. Elizabeth had transformed the most horrific of possibilities into a solution that allowed her to maintain both physical sustenance for her family and the outward appearance of order. The fire crackled in the hearth, the smell of stew mingled with herbs and smoke, and the household continued as if nothing had changed. The power of perception, the control of routine, and the careful orchestration of domestic life converged to create a terrifying equilibrium in which horror and normalcy coexisted seamlessly. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Elizabeth's mind remained vigilant. She monitored every bite taken by her children, every expression, every hesitation. Her awareness of their reactions was a critical part of her strategy, an assessment of how well her concealment had succeeded and whether any suspicion might arise. She understood that the success of her plan depended not only on physical actions, but on the subtleties of human perception. The tension was continuous, a silent pressure that shaped every movement, every word, and every decision. In this moment, the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. The family dinner, a symbol of domestic stability and nurturing, had been transformed into a stage for deception, psychological control, and survival-driven horror. Elizabeth's mastery of her environment, understanding of her family, and willingness to embrace moral transgression allowed her to navigate the unthinkable with a terrifying efficacy. The boundaries of morality, survival, and perception had been tested and manipulated in ways few could imagine, leaving a permanent mark on the history of this small Arizona settlement. The act also illustrates the extreme consequences of isolation and necessity. In a world where oversight was minimal, survival was paramount, and human psychology was stretched to its limits, ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts. Elizabeth's decision to turn the remains of her husband into sustenance was a grotesque manifestation of both ingenuity and moral collapse, an intersection of practical survival and unfathomable darkness. It was a calculated choice in a world that demanded resourcefulness, yet one that would forever define her as a figure of both horror and historical fascination. Even as the meal concluded and the family settled into the evening routine, the shadow of the act lingered invisibly in the air. The fire's glow cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, the silence punctuated by the occasional clatter of utensils and the muted voices of children preparing for bed. Elizabeth's composure remained absolute, yet within her mind a careful ledger of observation and anticipation continued. Each movement, each remark, each expression was catalogued and analyzed, ensuring that the secret remained secure. The extraordinary had been accomplished under the guise of the ordinary, and the terrifying balance between horror and domestic normalcy held firm, at least for now. The first hints of unease began almost imperceptibly. In a town as small and isolated as the Arizona settlement of 1876, everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet the vast distances between homes and the relentless demands of survival often dulled the attention to detail. It was in this environment that subtle anomalies could both go unnoticed and gradually provoke suspicion. Neighbors accustomed to the rhythms of domestic life and the predictable routines of familiar families began to detect minor inconsistencies in Elizabeth's household. At first, these were easy to dismiss. A quiet day where Thomas did not appear, a conversation that felt slightly forced, or a meal that carried a taste that seemed off. Such small discrepancies, when viewed in isolation, might have been attributed to exhaustion, illness, or simple oversight. Yet collectively they began to form a pattern that some could not ignore. Elizabeth's composure was unshakable, a deliberate performance perfected over years of careful observation and meticulous attention to detail. She continued to manage the household with the same precision as always, cooking meals, tending the children, and maintaining the home. Yet there was an underlying tension that the townspeople could sense, even if they could not articulate it. Friends and neighbors noticed the absence of Thomas, a man whose presence had once been a constant anchor in the community. Questions arose, posed quietly at first, framed in casual conversation, seeking explanations for his prolonged absence. The longer the mystery persisted, the more difficult it became to dismiss. In a place where the frontier imposed its own strict demands, the social fabric relied heavily on trust and observation, and Elizabeth's carefully maintained facade could not entirely escape scrutiny. Small, seemingly inconsequential details began to accumulate. A neighbor reported seeing Elizabeth at unusual hours, moving about the house in ways that seemed deliberate, almost furtive. Children, too young to understand the implications, occasionally mentioned their father's absence or the strangeness of the meals, their innocent observations carrying an unintentional weight. In such a tight-knit environment, where everyone was attuned to subtle shifts in behavior, these fragments of awareness began to coalesce into a growing unease. It was not immediate certainty, but a creeping suspicion, a sensation that something fundamental had changed within the household, a sense that all was not as it should be. As days turned into weeks, the cumulative effect of Elizabeth's meticulous deception became increasingly difficult to maintain. The normal rhythms of life in the settlement demanded Thomas's presence in ways that could no longer be easily avoided. Work that required his skill went uncompleted, conversations with other men of the town raised questions about his absence, and social expectations began to press more insistently. Elizabeth, aware of the growing scrutiny, intensified her vigilance. She monitored neighbors' observations, calculated her responses, and anticipated questions before they could be asked. The psychological tension was relentless. Every interaction carried the potential to unravel the careful equilibrium she had constructed. Despite her meticulous planning, human intuition proved difficult to suppress. Neighbors observed subtle irregularities, an unfamiliar odor, the occasional slip in her story, the nervous energy that flickered in her eyes when certain topics were broached. People began to compare notes quietly, their conversations punctuated with hesitation, uncertainty, and the instinctive fear of discovering something too terrible to acknowledge fully. The community's awareness grew slowly, like the rising tide, gaining force in ways that Elizabeth could not entirely control. The social bonds that had once provided protection now became a mechanism for discovery, as human curiosity and concern converged in a shared, unspoken suspicion. The children's behavior also contributed to the mounting unease. Though innocent, and unaware of the full extent of their mother's actions, They reacted in subtle ways to the absence of their father and the changes in household routine. Questions were asked at mealtimes, observations made in passing, and moods expressed that reflected the abnormality of the situation. Elizabeth, acutely aware of these interactions, had to navigate them carefully, providing answers that were plausible yet deflecting, maintaining control over both the household and the perception of those around her. The psychological strain was immense. She had to manage not only her own fear and guilt, but also the potential for revelation through the children's words or behaviors. Rumors began to circulate, as they inevitably do in small towns. People whispered in hushed tones about the disappearance of Thomas, about Elizabeth's unusual composure, about the strange quiet that seemed to envelop the home at times, the desert heat, the isolation, and the relentless demands of frontier. Life created a fertile environment for suspicion to grow unchecked. While no one could articulate the specifics of what had occurred, a collective sense of dread began to take hold, the community instinctively sensing that an extraordinary event had transpired behind the walls of Elizabeth's home. Investigation, in whatever form it could take, became an undercurrent in the town. There were no formal detectives readily available, no forensic tools to rely upon, yet human observation proved remarkably persistent. Questions were asked of merchants, neighbors, and family friends. Minor inconsistencies were noted and compared. Each fragment of information, no matter how small, contributed to a growing tapestry of suspicion. Elizabeth's careful manipulation of appearances was challenged by the inexorable force of human curiosity, which refused to be entirely subdued by routine, domestic precision, or the appearance of calm. The psychological burden of maintaining the facade grew heavier with each passing day. Elizabeth had to navigate a world in which any slip of the tongue, any gesture, any unintended signal could betray the secret she had worked so carefully to conceal. Every visitor to the house was both an observer and a potential threat, and every routine task became an exercise in maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The tension between her outward appearance and her internal reality created a claustrophobic environment, where fear and calculation were inseparably intertwined. As weeks and months passed, the weight of suspicion created a pervasive atmosphere of dread. Neighbors began to act with subtle caution, noting patterns and irregularities, while Elizabeth's vigilance intensified. Every meal prepared, every interaction with the children, every conversation with outsiders had to be meticulously managed to avoid arousing further inquiry. The frontier, with all its isolation and harsh conditions, provided both cover and constraint. It allowed her to act without immediate scrutiny, but also created a pressure cooker in which human observation and suspicion could gradually accumulate. Ultimately, the slow emergence of suspicion in the town illustrates the delicate balance between concealment and discovery in a frontier environment. Elizabeth's meticulous planning had initially allowed her to evade detection, but the small inconsistencies, human intuition, and the social dynamics of a close-knit settlement created a situation in which concealment became increasingly difficult. Each passing day added new pressure, each observation carried the potential for exposure, and the weight of unspoken questions began to shape the psychological landscape in which she operated. The invisible tension between the known and the unknown, between appearance and reality, became a defining feature of life in the household, and the unrelenting scrutiny of human perception began to close in, imperceptibly yet inexorably. The unraveling of Elizabeth's carefully constructed facade began gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like a faint crack in a plaster wall that would eventually widen into a chasm. In a frontier town such as this Arizona settlement in 1876, news traveled slowly, but human curiosity and suspicion had their own inexorable momentum. Small observations accumulated over time, creating a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Neighbors noticed subtle inconsistencies in Elizabeth's accounts, discrepancies in daily routines, and the persistent absence of Thomas, whose work in the surrounding territory was well known, and whose presence had once been taken for granted. These anomalies, seemingly minor in isolation, became the seeds of a creeping awareness that something beyond ordinary misfortune had occurred. Elizabeth's behavior, so meticulous and calculated, could no longer fully disguise the underlying tension. Her composure, once a protective mask, began to falter under the weight of cumulative observation. A hesitant glance, a pause in conversation, a slight overemphasis in explanation. Each seemingly minor gesture provided fodder for suspicion. Frontier communities, though preoccupied with survival, had a finely tuned sense of social and domestic normalcy. Deviations from this norm were noticed and remembered, particularly when they involved a familiar family whose routines had long been predictable. Even subtle changes, once pieced together, suggested the presence of a hidden narrative. The children, whose innocence had shielded them from understanding the events of that fateful day, began to contribute inadvertently to the emerging awareness. Their casual remarks, the questions they asked, the way they reacted to the absence of their father, and even the minor changes in their eating habits provided clues to attentive observers. Elizabeth had managed to maintain appearances at the surface, but children's responses are often unfiltered, instinctive, and revealing. Over time, these subtle indicators began to form a mosaic of suspicion that neighbors and friends could not easily dismiss. In such a small and isolated community, the line between gossip and investigation was thin. People discussed what they observed in hushed tones, comparing notes and quietly weighing possibilities. Merchants, travelers, and neighbors began asking pointed questions under the guise of casual conversation. They inquired about Thomas's work, his whereabouts, and the reasons for his absence. The more these inquiries multiplied, the more difficult it became for Elizabeth to maintain the story she had meticulously crafted. Human curiosity, coupled with the social interconnectivity of the settlement, created a slow, inexorable pressure on the truth, forcing cracks in the illusion she had so carefully upheld. The psychological tension within Elizabeth intensified as the scrutiny grew. She understood the fragility of her position. One misstep could expose everything. The act that had initially seemed contained and secure now began to feel perilously close to discovery. Every visitor, every question, every glance from a neighbor was scrutinized with the same intensity she had applied to her careful orchestration of the murder and concealment. Her mind was a constant ledger of potential threats and contingencies, calculating outcomes and monitoring reactions with relentless vigilance. This hyper-awareness, while protective, also magnified her stress and fear, reinforcing the sense that the secret was becoming increasingly untenable. The community's collective awareness eventually prompted a more formal inquiry, not yet law enforcement in the modern sense, but a frontier version of civic oversight. Concerned citizens, moved by intuition and the accumulation of unexplained irregularities, began pressing for answers. Elizabeth, accustomed to controlling appearances, now faced a situation in which she could no longer fully manage the narrative. Her usual tools, careful timing, routine, and social performance, were becoming insufficient against the sustained pressure of suspicion and inquiry. The frontier environment that had once afforded her cover now threatened exposure, as human observation, social expectation, and the instinct for justice converged. Neighbors began observing the household more systematically, noting details that had once gone unnoticed. The absence of Thomas became a central question, and casual visits to the home, initially framed as social concern, took on a sharper investigative edge. Questions about chores, work tasks, and family routines were asked, with an undercurrent of scrutiny designed to elicit answers that might reveal inconsistencies. Elizabeth responded with calm precision, yet the stress of continuous performance began to wear on her composure. The weight of maintaining a facade while under sustained observation created a psychological strain that mirrored the physical demands of frontier life, yet it was far more insidious, operating in the realm of perception and fear rather than immediate survival. Eventually, the tension reached a critical point when the cumulative pressure forced the discovery of evidence too significant to ignore. Perhaps it was a misplaced object, a slip of memory, or a comment from a child that no longer fit the narrative. Whatever the trigger, the secret that Elizabeth had so carefully protected began to unravel. Neighbors and friends pieced together the fragments of observation, aligning the anomalies with a growing awareness of absence, inconsistency, and the subtle cues that hinted at a crime. The realization was chilling. What had appeared to be an ordinary domestic life was, in fact, a meticulously concealed horror. The community's confrontation with the truth was as much psychological as it was physical. The horror lay not only in the act itself, but in the realization that deception had been maintained under their very noses. The ordinary routines of domestic life, the familiar appearances of care and responsibility, had masked something unimaginable. This tension between appearance and reality, a hallmark of frontier life where survival often demanded focus on immediate needs rather than moral scrutiny, amplified the sense of shock and disbelief. Neighbors, accustomed to dealing with practical problems and the harshness of frontier living, were now confronted with a moral and psychological complexity that unsettled the entire social fabric. Elizabeth's response to the growing awareness was a mixture of vigilance and instinctive manipulation. She attempted to control the narrative even as the net of observation tightened, using her knowledge of social expectation and human psychology to deflect, distract, or rationalize. Her performance, while increasingly strained, was a testament to the extent of her control and her understanding of human behavior. She was aware that exposure was possible, yet she remained engaged in the intricate balancing act of deception, persuasion, and observation, navigating a rapidly narrowing margin for error. The discovery of the truth, when it finally occurred, was a moment of profound horror and disbelief. The frontier, with all its isolation, danger, and harsh reality, had created the conditions for a crime that could remain hidden for months, yet human observation, intuition, and social interconnectedness ultimately prevailed. The cumulative effect of subtle inconsistencies, behavioral cues, and the persistence of communal inquiry had broken through the carefully constructed facade, exposing a crime that was at once extraordinary in its calculation and horrifying in its implications. The investigation, though limited by the resources and capabilities of the time, confirmed what had been suspected. Evidence that had once been hidden within the ordinary routines of domestic life was brought to light, revealing the meticulous orchestration of murder and concealment. The psychological and physical layers of the crime, once invisible, became undeniable, leaving the community to grapple with both the act itself and the moral and emotional ramifications. The frontier, which had provided cover and opportunity, could not shield Elizabeth forever. The persistent force of observation, suspicion, and social scrutiny ultimately illuminated the darkness she had sought to conceal. The aftermath of Elizabeth's crime rippled through the small Arizona settlement with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a creeping, uneasy fascination that would linger for decades. In a community accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life, unforgiving weather, isolation, and the constant struggle for survival, the revelation of such calculated malice and horror was almost incomprehensible. People struggled to reconcile the familiar image of a dutiful wife and mother with the monstrous reality that had unfolded behind closed doors. Families whispered in corners, merchants paused mid-conversation, and children sensed, without understanding, that something profoundly unnatural had occurred. The act itself, unthinkable in its cold deliberation, left an indelible mark on the town, reshaping social bonds and collective perception in ways that no one could have predicted. Elizabeth herself became a figure of contradiction, simultaneously human and terrifying, maternal and monstrous. Her outward composure, which had carried her through the murder and concealment, began to falter under the weight of social scrutiny and internal reckoning. She faced a dual reality, one in which the practical mechanisms of survival had once justified her actions, and another in which the moral, psychological, and social consequences were impossible to ignore. The townspeople, once her neighbors, and casual acquaintances now regarded her with suspicion, fear, and morbid curiosity. Her every gesture, conversation, and movement was examined for subtle clues, a stark reminder that the invisible threads of observation could never fully be severed. The children, innocent witnesses in ways they could not articulate, were profoundly affected, though their understanding remained fragmented. They experienced a household transformed by secrecy, tension, and the absence of a father, with an omnipresent sense that their mother's world was no longer entirely safe or predictable. The psychological imprint on them would linger, as even the most naive perception of daily life was irreversibly altered by the knowledge, implicit or explicit, of what had occurred. Elizabeth had not only shaped their physical reality through her actions, but had also imposed an invisible, lingering psychological architecture that would resonate long after the immediate events had passed. The community's response to the revelation of Elizabeth's crime was shaped by both the practical realities of frontier life and the human need to process moral outrage. Law enforcement at the time was minimal, and official investigation was often slow, inconsistent, and constrained by resources. Nevertheless, the social mechanisms of observation and collective judgment functioned with a potency that modern investigators might envy. Neighbors and townspeople acted as both witnesses and informal adjudicators, piecing together evidence, reconciling inconsistencies, and weighing the moral implications of what they had learned. This communal process, driven by curiosity, fear, and a sense of justice, became a subtle but inexorable force shaping Elizabeth's position within the settlement. Elizabeth's psychological state during this period was complex, a tangle of self-justification, fear, and the instinctive drive to maintain control. She understood, perhaps with clarity that both frightened and empowered her, that the extraordinary nature of her actions would make her a subject of intense scrutiny and gossip. Her mind, once trained to compartmentalize moral horror in the pursuit of survival, now faced the constant reminder that human perception was not easily deceived indefinitely. The community's suspicion, combined with the awareness of what she had done, created an ongoing internal tension that shaped her behavior, speech, and daily life. Every interaction became a negotiation, every glance a test, and every remark a potential trigger for discovery or confrontation. In the broader historical context, Elizabeth's actions became a grim case study in the intersection of isolation, survival, and human psychology. Frontier life in 1876. Arizona demanded resourcefulness, adaptability, and resilience. Yet it also created circumstances in which moral and ethical boundaries could be distorted, stretched, or even suspended. The absence of immediate oversight, the scarcity of resources, and the intensity of domestic pressure combined to create a crucible in which extraordinary acts of desperation and calculation could emerge. Elizabeth's crime illustrates not only the capacity for human cruelty, but also the ways in which environment, circumstance, and social isolation can converge to produce outcomes that defy conventional understanding of morality and behavior. The social and historical implications of the case were far-reaching. Even after the immediate events receded from the daily consciousness of the town, the story persisted as a cautionary tale, passed down in whispers, recollections, and retellings that carried both fascination and horror. It shaped perceptions of domestic life, marriage, and female agency within the frontier context. Elizabeth's actions challenged assumptions about the limits of human behavior in constrained circumstances, forcing the community and later generations to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, survival, and the hidden capacities within ordinary individuals. Elizabeth herself became a living emblem of the duality inherent in human nature, the capacity for care and nurture alongside the potential for calculated violence and deception. Her identity, once grounded in domestic respectability and maternal responsibility, became inseparably intertwined with the memory of the crime. Even those who had known her intimately could no longer reconcile the image of the woman they had interacted with daily with the historical record of her actions. The psychological tension between familiarity and horror created a unique space in which Elizabeth's life was simultaneously normalized and grotesquely marked by the memory of violence. The children, the neighbors, and the community at large were forced to navigate the moral and emotional fallout of the crime. Practical concerns, food, survival, social cohesion, remained, yet they were now overlaid with the psychological weight of the extraordinary transgression that had occurred within the household. The story of Thomas's death and the subsequent concealment of the act became both a subject of fascination and a lens through which the community examined its own assumptions about trust, observation, and the nature of domestic normalcy. Over time, the case transcended its immediate temporal and geographic context. becoming part of the broader historical narrative of dark and extraordinary events that challenge conventional understanding. Historians, writers, and cultural observers have cited such events to illustrate the interplay between human psychology, environmental pressures, and social dynamics. Elizabeth's actions, though horrifying, serve as a stark reminder of the extraordinary consequences that can emerge when isolation, opportunity, and psychological acuity converge. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the fragility of social facades, and the capacity for concealment and deception that exists even in ostensibly ordinary lives. The legacy of the crime is thus multifaceted. It is a narrative of horror, a study in psychological complexity, and a historical record that illuminates the broader conditions of life on the frontier. The community's response, the lingering suspicion, and the enduring fascination with the case underscore the ways in which human perception, morality, and social norms interact with circumstance to produce consequences that are both immediate and enduring. Elizabeth's calculated actions, her capacity for concealment, and the eventual unraveling of her secret illustrate the delicate interplay between environment, opportunity, and the darker potentials of human behavior. Even decades later, the story of Elizabeth and Thomas resonated as a cautionary tale, a dark whisper of what can occur when isolation, desperation, and human cunning intersect. The events of that summer in 1876 remained embedded in the collective memory of the region, retold with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and fascination. It became a symbol of the fragile boundary between ordinary domestic life and extraordinary transgression, a reminder that even the most familiar environments can conceal unimaginable darkness. If this story sent a chill down your spine and left you questioning the darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces, then there's so much more waiting for you. Stories like Elizabeth's reveal the hidden truths of history, the secrets that time tries to bury, and the human psyche at its most extreme. Every week we uncover tales of forbidden acts, chilling mysteries, and the shadows of our past that are stranger and darker than fiction. If you want to journey deeper into the secrets that history doesn't want you to know, now is the time to join our community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know about the past. Each tale is meticulously researched and crafted to pull you into the suspense, to make you see the human experience in its rawest, darkest form. But this channel isn't just about watching, it's about engaging, questioning, and exploring together. We want to hear from you. After watching, leave a comment and tell us your thoughts. What would you have done if faced with a secret like this? Do you think Elizabeth's actions were driven more by survival, desperation, or something darker? Your opinions help shape our community and spark conversations about the shadows of history that continue to haunt us today. Don't forget, every click, every comment, and every share helps us uncover more forbidden stories. Subscribe, engage, and become part of the journey into the hidden, the forbidden, and the chilling truths that history doesn't dare to tell.